your genitals don't lie.
I love that. Your genitals don't lie.
For the next 40 minutes or so, we are going to talk to you about stuff, about measuring the penis and the cervix, to be more precise. Phallometric and cervimetric procedures figure prominently on our respective dissertation projects, and we are looking forward to introducing you to this special realm of scientific and clinical practice.
And this is how we will proceed. We will start by introducing the two cases. What is phallometry and cervimetry? Why were they developed and how were they used? We will then explain why we find these cases so interesting and also so important to study. First, because they are still in use today and they have enormous social consequences for the people involved. Second, they were highly controversial, even among the practitioners themselves. And because they were controversial, and this is the third reason why we find them so interesting, they provide excellent meeting ground for the history, philosophy, and social study of the sciences. This is what we explore for the rest of the presentation. We introduce a conceptual framework of the measuring process and distinguish different types of errors and strategies to avoid them. Basically, this is a discussion of the methodological challenges that the practices of phallometry and cervimetry pose to their practitioners. And in a series of concluding comments, we then add our perspectives of what we find specifically interesting in these cases and how they speak to a fruitful combination of the history, philosophy, and social study of science. And we hope this will give us a good starting point for the following discussion. So, what exactly is phallometry, and why would you even measure your cervix?
Phallic measurements, or phallometry, as we know today, were started to be used in the 1950s by the Czech psychiatrist Kurt Freund, who was searching for a way to objectively, quote-unquote, diagnose homosexuals. The typical procedure involves a patient or test subject to whom sexual stimuli, for instance, photographs, films, or audio tapes, are presented. Meanwhile, the changes in erectile volume or circumference were measured by the phallometric devices and, most times, presented as a line on a polygraph. The method was then adopted in the 1960s by British and US American researchers and psychiatrists to evaluate the effectiveness of treatment for deviancies and predict recidivism of sex offenders. Diagnosis of deviancy or prediction of recidivism was based on the relative amount of erectile change to the different stimuli. Treatment efficacy was evaluated by measuring the increased latency of erection onset after a regime of painful electric shocks. Nowadays, phallometric methods are mostly used either to do basic research on male sexual arousal, diagnose impotence, or, still, in the American and British penal system.
Like phallic measurements, the measurement of the cervix was used as a way of quantifying patient physiology to investigate research claims. At least, this is what we see in the early 20th century German context. Eventually, this research method became seen as an essential clinical practice. Cervical measurement now provides data for daily clinical decisions in real time, a transformation which took place in the 1950s to 70s American context. Unlike phallic measurements, the measurement of the cervix was not about sexuality or psychology, but about quantifying labor progress. More specifically, evaluating and predicting labor outcomes. And unlike penile measurements, this methodological history of cervimetry ends exactly where it begins. Despite many valiant attempts to find some objective device to perform this measurement, the way the cervix was measured at the end of the 20th century is still the best practice used today, by hand. The doctor or nurse reaches into the vaginal canal, inserts 2 fingers into the cervical opening, and stretches them apart to estimate the distance. Or, as Dr. Michael Green explains,
what will happen is the doctor or the nurse will put their fingers in your vagina and they'll feel your cervix,
And we have a pretty good idea by what it feels like how many centimeters that actually is.
The data resulting from this process is the width of dilation, recorded repeatedly over time and graphed on a chart called a partogram or partograph. These obstetric charts vary in complexity, but always center around tracking dilation. These measurements are purported in centimeters from 0 to 10, such as 2.5 centimeters of dilation, with 10 being full dilation. Again, in Dr. Green's words,
so the cervix starts, it's like a donut, and it starts off closed. As you go into labor, the cervix will gradually open more and more and more, and that's measured in centimeters. And it's how many centimeters open the cervix is at any given time. And that will be a number that will be given. It'll be the first number given when we talk about a cervical exam. 10 centimeters is fully dilated. That's the goal. So you're trying to get to 10 as we move through.
Now, some of you may say,
"You're talking to me about stuff. Why?"
Well, we think that there are several good reasons to take a closer look at these bizarre measurement practices. The first of them being that they are still practiced today, and this with incisive consequences. In a 2014 episode of BBC's Undercover Doctor, for example, broadcaster Christian Jessen was able to bring his audience into a sexual orientation test booth at Cornell University. There, psychologist Gerda Frieger introduced him to a test similar to the one Merlin just mentioned.
The whole point of the experiment is that you see a series of videos, either naked men or naked women.
Yeah.
And we will measure your bodily response through this penile arousal gauge. Mm-hmm. You just attach that to the middle of your penis.
The show introduces phallometry in a lighthearted and humorous way. The test maker at some point quipped that the subject
might like the clouds actually a little bit more than the women.
And the latter was happy to find out that
I've been scored 100% for attraction to the same sex, so officially, I'm about as gay as they come.
It was this sentence that prompted Krieger to say,
"Your genitals don't lie,"
implying that the physiological test will provide a clear-cut and honest answer to the question whether a person is homo or heterosexual.
But, as you can imagine, such sexual orientation tests were the cause of immense suffering. I've already mentioned that subjects whose penis reacted to certain images were branded and persecuted as quote-unquote sexual deviants. In other cases, men who claimed to be homosexual but did in fact react to straight porn were denied asylum. No longer than 11 years ago, Czech authorities used phallometric tests to assess whether homosexual asylum seekers are genuinely gay. It was this very scandal that inspired German director Thor Iben to make a short film.
Ich habe damals davon in den Nachrichten gehört, ich glaube zuerst im Radio. Die Geschichte war so absurd, dass ich darauf sofort eingestiegen bin und dachte, okay, daraus muss man einen Kurzfilm machen.
Wir haben halt hier so einen Flüchtling aus dem Iran, der tut so, als sei er schwul. Da müssen wir mal nachgehen der ganzen Sache, ob das auch stimmt. Deswegen haben wir uns diese Scheißmethode einfallen lassen. What?
One reviewer was quick to link the procedure portrayed in the film to the test originally developed by Kurt Freund. This reviewer further claimed that thanks to Freund's studies, homosexuality was decriminalized in Czechoslovakia in 1961, and that men who tested as gay could evade military service in the 1950s. It is true, according to historian Caterina Schürch, that sexual scientists were essential for the decriminalization of homosexuality in Czechoslovakia. Yet this wasn't Freund's doing alone. And Freund didn't so much help recruits. His method and expertise were used to differentiate true homosexuals from fakes.
Cervimetry, too, provided the basis for decisions which impacted people's lives. In the research context of the early 20th century, cervical measures were used to present a before-after picture to evaluate the effects of certain birthing interventions. For example, in the 1950s, German obstetric researchers were interested in evaluating whether breaking a patient's water affected labor progress. This provided inspiration to American obstetricians who were interested in the effects of epidural and other interventions on labor. Thus, this research method eventually came to shape decisions made in the clinical context. Measuring the cervix in centimeters has since reformed the definition of what it means for labor to be stalled or arrested. Labor arrest, now defined by cervical dilation thresholds, leads to the administration of hormonal treatments such as Pitocin to artificially induce contractions. Arrest can also prompt the use of surgical interventions, such as performing episiotomy or cesarean section, also known as C-section. C-sections, which pose greater health risks to mother, fetus, and bring greater complication to future births, have become alarmingly common in the US, with about a third of labors ending in this surgical method. A 2011 study conducted by Barber et al. Estimated that about 34% of C-sections in the US are performed due to a diagnosis of arrested labor, as defined by cervical dilation thresholds. A second reason is that the actors themselves critically questioned their and their colleagues' measurements and the claims derived from them. They doubted or defended the usefulness of certain measurement procedures and correspondingly called for new techniques and instruments, or argued that no such instruments are needed.
The father of phallometry, Kurt Freund, for example, was not at all sure that genitals don't lie. In 1977, he noted that, quote, the extent of the usefulness of the phallometric method appears to depend very much on further research on response suppression and false positives, end quote. Other critics objected that the penile platysmograph was subject to distortions and that the investigation was performed under unnatural conditions. Others still preferred using smaller circumference measuring devices, noting that Freund's large device might be very sensitive, while this sensitivity lacked, quote, functional relevance, end quote.
Controversies in cervimetry abounded as well throughout the 20th century. In the 1950s, one instrument maker claimed that his device for measuring the cervix merely served to show that measuring with fingers, that is, digital examination, was perfectly adequate for both research and clinical purposes, and that his own device was obsolete and inconvenient by comparison. There was also the concern that the devices themselves could be altering the dilation process, and that readings were of a distorted cervix. This is somewhat similar to concerns about penile measures taken in unnatural conditions. By the late 70s and early 80s, partograms were becoming widely used in US labor practices, with normal and abnormal labor progress well defined by dilation thresholds in centimeters. This exactitude, suggested by these charts, revived efforts to replace the digital or finger method with a so-called objective instrument to be used in daily labor practice. The importance of accurate and reliable cervical assessment in centimeters for clinical purposes was debated once again and continues to be debated today.
The most puzzling and, as it were, the most stimulating feature of the episodes is that cervimetry and phallometry are neither obvious successes nor complete failures. And it is here that we want to dig deeper and to try to understand better how and why they failed and how and why they didn't. Historiography and social studies and cultural studies and philosophy of science offer various tools to help us dig deeper.
And this brings me to a third reason to focus on phallo and cervimetry. Research activities such as measuring, we believe, provide a promising meeting ground for history, philosophy, and sociology of science. These fields have a traditional interest in the activity of measuring and in values associated with good measurements, such as precision. And we have not yet given up the idea that they are interested in one and the same phenomenon. So, let's get to work and start with some conceptual clarifications, which is Kärin's turn.
It may be a good idea at this point to clarify what we have in mind when we speak of measuring and measurement, and explain what we find interesting in it. There is, of course, a huge body of literature on this topic. Here's the entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia. It is mostly on physical systems and physical parameters. And if I quote Erantal here, despite this huge literature, there's little consensus among philosophers as to how to define measurement. And perhaps this should not surprise us, because in all probability, there is not the one definition that captures everything. And we are more modest anyway. What we want to understand is how measurement works in specific cases. So let me start with a well-known textbook example, Lavoisier's ice calorimeter. So the question that Lavoisier had was simple, right? Lavoisier wanted to find out how much heat was generated if a certain amount of substance X was combusted. And to answer this question, he created a measuring device, and this is the ice calorimeter here. Essentially, it is a fireproof chamber here, where material is combusted, which is surrounded by another chamber that is filled with ice, or even two more chambers filled with ice. And if the material is combusted in the chamber, then a certain amount of ice melted, and it dropped into a vessel down here at D. And then the meltwater was weighed, and from the weight of the meltwater, the amount of heat was inferred. But as Lavoisier wanted to measure heat, but what he actually measured was the weight of meltwater. This is odd once we come to think about it, and I suggest that the following framework helps to unpack this procedure. So there are several elements and processes involved in this measuring process, and also, I argue, in others. So first, there is the investigated or monitored process. So this is the process that we actually want to learn about, and correspondingly, the investigated variable. In Lavoisier's case, he wanted to learn about the quantity of heat from the combustion of X. Second, there is the measuring process, and correspondingly, the measured variable. In the Lavoisier example, this is the weight of meltwater. Importantly, Lavoisier was only able to infer something about the investigated variable from the measured variable because they were well established, in this case, even quantifiable causal links between them. So the diagnostic inferences from the one to the other are justified. But the measured variable, so the weight in this case, still is an abstract entity. So if we want to actually perceive something here in the measuring process, we still have to translate it into an observable. And that is the third element in this scheme. In this case, it may be the pointer position of the scale. In other cases, it is the level of the manometer's liquid. So that actually is the main function of measuring devices. They provide us with visible indicators of the state of the measured variable. And again, we can only infer something about the measured variable from the observable if there are well-established and controlled, reliable causal links. So on this account, measuring practices provide us with starting points for diagnostic inferences from something that we can observe to something that we cannot observe. This may be an amount of combustion heat, or it may also be states of sexual arousal. So Merlin and Becker, is this applicable to your cases?
Phallometric practices can certainly be captured in this vocabulary. Researchers like Freund tried to measure an invisible investigative variable via erectile changes as measured in change of circumference or volume, displayed as an observable polygraph line.
If I look at the penile gauge, he's just really aroused.
Similarly, with cervimetry, actors tried to use cervical dilation as a so-called objective measure of labor progress. As a result, today, labor progress and cervical dilation are often used as synonymous terms. As Dr. Green says,
and then we'll be able to judge how dilated you are and see the progress of labor. So that's dilatation.
And on top of that, there was the need to use hands or other instruments to even assess dilation, which itself was not directly observable.
Now that our goal is to
understand better how and why they failed,
let's hear Kärin's account of the
many different ways in which measuring can go wrong. Let me single out first procedural errors. These are errors that occur although everything was fine in principle, but somebody made mistakes along the way. For example, mishandled the device or mistook the readings or was simply incompetent to carry out the measuring process. On the other end of the spectrum, there may be theoretical errors. So the project may be based on a false theory or using misguided concepts, or possibly the investigative process does not even exist. But most interesting for our panel is the class of methodological errors. Errors that typically concern the questions of whether or not the measuring process was appropriate and whether or not the inferences were justified. The question immediately then was, what can be done about it? A starting point was, for example, to test and hopefully confirm the causal links between the processes and variables. If the causal links were confirmed, the measuring process also might be reconsidered because we have to ensure that it is specific, sensitive, and robust. But these are virtues that sometimes have to be traded against each other. And then there are the confounders, which always threaten to undermine the results, factors which influence the process beyond our control and which we have to get rid of. So, any thoughts about this from the experts?
These issues can definitely be identified in discussions about the value of cervical and phallic measurements. Let me start with the problem of the contested causality between the measuring and the monitored process. When the first rigorous measurement of the cervix was attempted, it was accepted knowledge that cervical dilation did not have a clean causal link to the rest of labor progress. That is, the investigated process of labor could not be entirely accounted for with the investigated variable of cervical dilation. Labor was known to be complex and unpredictable, even with a multitude of indicators. But unlike other features of labor, such as the intensity or number of contractions, the cervical ripeness, the fetal distress, and the maternal breathing patterns, at least dilation appeared to be quantifiable. It had a convenient scale from 0 to 10 and a more or less consistent pattern of growth in between. This made dilation an attractive candidate for quantifying at least something about labor progress that could be graphed over time on a sheet of paper. The conflation of dilation state as being a proxy for labor progress came later, and more recently is being re-examined and contested. Additionally, even the very limited use of cervical dilation as the investigated variable here has continually evaded instrumental methods for robustly assigning a measured variable to it, in this case, centimeters. Though the by-hand method remains the best practice for cervimetry, throughout the 20th century, devices called cervimeters were constructed of various styles and techniques, all of which ended up being resounding failures in the clinical context. Regardless, attempts to replace the by-hand method with an instrumental method have been relentless, and cervimeters continue to be devised to no avail even today. One difficulty in achieving a measuring process which can turn cervical dilation into an observable is the comparative hiddenness of dilation as a physiological phenomenon, as compared to, say, penile rigidity or girth. Cervical dilation itself is already a far too simplistic reduction, and yet even this one simple dimension is extremely difficult to access. First of all, we can't observe it visually. Even with the 3D ultrasound imaging techniques that we have now, we can't effectively account for cervical softness or stretch. Our hands so far are the best observers we have for this purpose. It's an incredibly difficult dimension to pin down. And when I say pin down, I mean that literally. The first American instrument which was devised replacing this process, Emanuel Friedman's cervimeter, kept slipping off the cervical os and was incredibly difficult to maneuver in and out of place, requiring the patient to remain completely still and in a prone position in the midst of labor. So a second device was developed with needles that would pierce both sides of the cervix to hold it in place. This gruesome method also failed for a different reason, which I'll discuss more in a moment. Now that you have a clearer picture of the issues that cervimetry needed to overcome, we can now look in more detail at the solutions which have been tried and why they have come up short. When attempting to develop a cervimeter, practitioners' primary challenge was that of establishing validity of a device to represent the diameter of dilation. With the by-hand method under question, they lacked a clear gold standard to which a new measurement procedure could be compared. The best they could do was establish a mutual agreement between methods of measurement. The first American to make a device for measuring the cervix, Emanuel Friedman, used the agreement between his mechanical cervimeter, which he constructed in the 1950s, with his own measurements by hand to mutually justify the validity of both methods. And this epistemic argument is not merely a relic of the past. Likewise, in 2009, Zimmerman et al. Conducted a study on the potential of 3D ultrasound methods of cervimetry, and they too compared their results with by-hand assessments to evidence the accuracy of their imaging technologies estimates. So at first, it may not make much sense that an instrument which was meant to replace the by-hand method of cervimetry is then validated by comparison with the same antiquated method. Yet consider that a measurement process which has been validated outside of the body has not necessarily been validated inside the body. And once inside the body, our ability to observe that the measuring process has not been altered by confounding factors or by the bodily process itself reacting to being measured is limited. A common way that practitioners argued that the distance they recorded actually corresponded to cervical dilation was to ensure that the device had not slipped off its intended target. In most cases, this was done with clips, needles, hooks, or screws. As previously mentioned, these devices limited the movement and the laboring body's ability to perform its physiological functions during labor and had the potential for laceration and infection, risking sepsis and threatening the life of the patient. Even for ultrasonic imaging methods, which seem like they would be less invasive and less limiting to the body, sensors still needed to be inserted and kept in place on opposite sides of the cervical rim. Evidencing proper placement was also tricky. Friedman claimed that X-ray images showed that his 1956 mechanical cervimeter was attached to the right target. Yet he also found by feeling with his hand that his 1963 model of cervimeter had affected dilation itself by preventing one half of the cervix from dilating as rapidly as the other half. He eventually came to believe that any such independent sensors placed on opposite sides of the cervical os will move closer to one another as one half of the cervical os dilates and thus no longer measures a true diameter. So whereas inflexible instruments brought undue influence on the bodily process being measured, flexible instruments allowed for undue bodily influence on the measuring process. These are the kind of methodological issues that traditional measurement accounts, grounded in simple examples of already solved physics problems seen in hindsight, are not able to account for, except under the very general umbrella of validity and liability assessment. In the context of cervimetry, issues such as ensuring that the physiological process of dilatation is not interrupted or altered by the measuring process, and that devices used are not endangering or limiting the labor, trumped the importance of traditional notions of validity and reliability testing that could take place outside the body. As a result, no standardized instrument has succeeded at replacing the by-hand method, as archaic and unsophisticated as it may seem to the untrained eye or the untrained hand.
That's 1 centimeter. The mouth of this particular one is 10 centimeters. Again, dual purpose. The bottom is about 9. So just go through your kitchen, find some things, measure them for accuracy, and then just mark on there what they are, and then you can practice like that. I have created several cervixes. Take one of your socks, put your cervix in, check your cervix, and yes indeed, there's my fingertip cervix.
Although the causal relationship between arousal and erections was not exactly seen as unsubstantiated, it turned out to be a more complicated one than the one between heat and ice in the example of the calorimeter. For instance, there soon was some evidence that people only noticed their erections and therefore their own arousal after a certain threshold of about 10% maximum erection was reached. Were the erectile changes below the threshold to be counted as arousal, since there was a change in erection, or not, since the subjects often did not feel aroused at this level? In other words, was it sexual arousal that caused this erection onset? The biggest problem by far regarding the measuring process was the confounding factor of having a person be involved. More precisely, it was clear very early on that test subjects could strengthen or suppress erections via the awesome power of their imagination. Subjects were consistently able to do this, which seriously put into question any inference drawn from erectile measurements, since it was unclear if changes were due to stimuli or to the subject's influence. Freund's attempt at increasing the validity of phallometric measurements involved flooding the patient's mind. By bombarding his test subject with pictures in quick succession, Freund hoped he could make impossible any attempt at faking erections. Most times, however, researchers tried to gather external evidence, i.e. evidence outside the measurement process, to establish the validity of their measuring process. Since trusting and asking the patients was often not an option, the actors turned to different methods to ascertain the validity. They appealed, as did Raymond Rosen and Peter Koppel, for instance, to the aesthetics of the curves on the polygraph, since they deemed them too gradual to have been influenced by faking. Independent raters, i.e. experts, could also rate the offenders in order to compare ratings and measurements, or simple anecdotal circumstances could reveal that subjects had been faking a response. In one case, a recruit trying to evade military service who had been tested as homosexual by Freund was caught by the police spying on female students changing clothes in a locker room. Finally, there was some debate about whether to standardize tests as much as possible, especially the erotic stimuli used, or to make them highly idiosyncratic. Standardization, as favored by Freund and others, was supposed to not only ensure comparability between cases, but also to ensure that people reacted to the same part of the stimulus as others. The arguments for idiosyncrasy were that, assuming responses weren't faked, one could produce a stimulus, for instance an audio tape, that would reliably and consistently produce maximum erections in subjects, since this was the most erotic stimulus for this particular person. These actors tried to make the research situation as natural as possible.
Now it's time to hear Jutta's
cantankerous comments from the balcony. One goal we initially had in mind with this session was to use the measuring practices to bring philosophy of measurement in closer contact with historical perspectives. I would like to pursue this goal in a more roundabout way. Instead of reflecting on main topics in philosophy of measurement and main topics in history of measurement and potential points of contact, I want to start with some commonplace assumptions about measurement. What always comes to mind when we think about measurement is the well-worn statement by William Thomson, also known as Lord Kelvin. When you cannot measure it, when you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. He said that in his essay on electrical units of measurement. Even the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on measurement begins with a reference to this statement as a reminder of the privileged epistemic status that is traditionally attached to measurements and by extension to the physical sciences. There are in fact two assumptions tied to Thomson's statement. One, quantification is a good thing, and two, the physical sciences are the model sciences, other sciences are inferior by comparison. Phalometry and cervimetry sit a little awkwardly with these assumptions. First of all, of course, they are not physical sciences, but more importantly, measurement in these contexts is not necessarily a good thing in either case. In the 1940s, economist Frank Knight took Thomson's famous statements to the social and behavioral sciences. If you cannot measure, measure anyhow. Knight's quip points to an undue extension of measurement practices to the social sciences. Social scientists who try to measure social phenomena perform some other operation and call it measurement. In doing so, they either embezzle a word for its prestige value, or they measure something else instead of what was ostensibly under discussion, or both. So that is one thing to consider in our context. To what extent were the prestige of measuring and the perceived values of precision initial driving forces for both phalometry and cervimetry? How valued was precision in mid-20th century biology and medicine? But there are also issues with the measuring procedures themselves. There are many moving parts here, and some of these issues could be framed in terms of Jim Bogan's and Jim Woodward's distinction between data and phenomena. Practitioners of phalometry and cervimetry are producing data, the measurements, but what they are interested in are phenomena for which the data are evidence, the progress of labor in one case or arousal. The distinction between data and phenomena, it seems, is helpful in two ways. First, it draws our attention to the fact that the connection between measurements and measured things is not obvious. It is, in fact, the researcher's task to establish it. This task is both practical and conceptual. It involves inferences, tools, and techniques, all of which have to be aligned or coordinated in a convincing way. Second, the nature and characteristics of the phenomenon in phalometry and cervimetry are actually quite different. Think about what exactly is measured in phalometry. The phenomenon remains elusive as the researchers modify their assumption and devices. One could think about the dynamics of this process in terms of Hazok Chang's notion of epistemic iteration, whereby a quantity concept and a measurement procedure are codependent and progressively emerge in tandem, as it were, and also in coordination. In cervimetry, by contrast, the researchers measure simple physical quantity, the size of an opening, which sounds very straightforward, definitely more straightforward than Hazok Chang's only deceptively simple examples of measuring temperature or the measurement of this elusive quantity of arousal. But of course, cervimetry is not straightforward at all. The problem here is not conceptual, however. The tools and techniques are the issue. We're not trying to measure diameters of bottle caps or cans of beans, which probably would be fairly straightforward. The opening we want to measure is inside a female body in labor. It is squishy, it's variable, and it's really hard to access. And as we have seen, that creates numerous practical difficulties, which have to do with designing the device, with placing it, with holding it still, with holding the patient in place, and so on and so forth. And there are ethical concerns intertwined with the practical, which are familiar from other invasive human subjects research. And we have the familiar question, how much and what kinds of invasion are justified? Do the expected benefits from this research outweigh the harms of the subject's experience, and so on? And then there's a conceptual issue here as well, which is the lack of a standard dilation against which the measurements could be calibrated. Phallometry had practical problems too, of course. One problem was that the confounders could not adequately be screened off. And moreover, once the measurements were actually carried out, more and more confounders surfaced, which led to more challenges for the experimental design. In principle, the emergence of more potential confounders during an experimentation or experimental setting is not a bad thing, because we are learning something new about the complex relation between data and phenomena and how to coordinate those. However, in a way, one is reluctant to say anything positive about the practice of phallometry. It fails on a more basic level. The phallometry case is more perfidious than measuring for prestige. Here, the prestige of measuring is deployed to bolster claims about normalcy and deviance. The case of phallometry is a reminder that long cherished notions about quantitative knowledge as the paradigm of sound knowledge can themselves be detrimental. And we have substantial scholarship in medicine and cultural history that can help understand how the history of phallometry intersects with the history of the normal. As we can see, there are numerous ways in which we can examine the success and failure of cervimetry and phallometry. All of them strike me as relevant, and all are intertwined. And taken together, the two practices challenge Thompson's statement on a much more fundamental level than Knight did. In both cases, it appears that what is expressed in number is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind.
So much from the balcony, but where does that leave us here on the ground? One general assumption about quantification down? Many new questions. And what about the pursuit of an integrated history and philosophy of measuring? Jutta decided against a direct confrontation between philosophical and historiographical studies on measurement. And this is not by chance, I argue. The philosophical literature on measurement is anything but full of discussions of specific activities and goals and norms directly associated with them, in contrast to the literature on mechanisms, for example. So there seems little point in investigating whether historical cases can be analyzed according to philosophical expectations. Fortunately, this in no way implies that the study of survey and phallometric practices cannot be an HBS project. On the contrary, it offers an opportunity to advance our historiographical and philosophical understanding simultaneously. Of course, the goal of such a project cannot be to develop the theory of measurement. But Merlin and Becker show today that it is entirely possible to track historical actors' measurement activities. One finding is particularly encouraging: the finding that the norms that guided the researchers' and clinicians' actions are tractable. For this purpose, it is worthwhile to focus on the instruments the actors used.
The issue of circumference versus volumetric devices is a case in point. Volumetric phallometers undoubtedly were the more precise devices, yet when Freund set out to develop his platismograph, he initially also thought this to be a very simple device. However, the more Freund and his colleagues tried to circumvent confounding thoughts, the more intricate their laboratory setups were made, and the more important sensitivity and precision of their devices became. Standardized slides, extremely short exposure times, and the large, uncomfortable, yet precise glass cylinder point towards one overarching norm in Freund's experiments: maximum control over the entire research situation. Circumference devices, on the other hand, were initially seen as quote-unquote modified Freund platismographs. They were thought to measure volumetric changes just as well as Freund's device, while also being cheaper, easier to use, and less obtrusive. Yet when Freund challenged the usefulness of circumference phallometers, the actors who used them were unwilling to give them up. While cost was certainly one reason why they didn't switch to large glass cylinders, it wasn't the only one. These researchers had developed highly idiosyncratic procedures in which their devices were used, involving the patient's dress in fetishized clothes, have them masturbate, and exposing them to long auditory stimuli, which were fashioned after the patient's fantasy. Freund's confounding thoughts. They had developed a therapeutic and research setting in which, contrary to Freund, control was handed over in substantial parts to the patients themselves in an attempt to make the laboratory environment as natural as possible. Unsurprisingly, no researcher who used a volumetric device ever switched to a circumference phallometer and vice versa. Too diverse were the foundational norms on which they built their respective research practices.
Studying measurement practices not only will help us to understand better how researchers try to gain empirical access to phenomena of interest, but especially how they try to validate their assumptions about the measuring process. Here again, it's particularly valuable to work out the material and conceptual resources they relied on to do so. In both Merlin and Becker's cases, the validity of one measurement process was determined by how well it agreed with the results of another measurement process that was taken to measure the same phenomenon. In 1984, sex researcher Barry Singer used the same strategy to assess the validity of the concept of sexual arousal. He compared the different ways to measure this phenomenon and found many discrepancies, even within one class of measurements. His own study of animal behavior, for example, showed that animals deprived of food and sexual contact work harder to access food than to access sex partners. However, even very hungry animals chose sex partner over food. Singer argued that sexual arousal is not a unitary construct and that the observed measurement discrepancies reflect this fact. He justified this conclusion with reference to other similar phenomena such as the emotion aggression and wrote, "There is no more reason to settle on the measure of sexual arousal than to settle on the measure of, for instance, aggression." This is all to say that these historical cases provide first-rate material to examine the epistemic, material, and social aspects of the research activity of measuring. And this should not only be interesting to historians, but also to philosophers. Becca, please.
There are a few things I find particularly philosophically intriguing about the history of cervimetry. At different points in this history, certain classic problems of measurement are nearly ignored, or at least set aside for other concerns. For example, the necessity of establishing a clean causal link between the investigated process of labor progress and the investigated variable of cervical dilation. And I think this follows from the necessity of the task at hand. After all, when it comes to saving patient lives, you measure what you can, however you can, when you can. Another thing about this history, which may seem odd to philosophers, the coordination between numerical and empirical properties, that is, the assignment of centimeters to track dilatation, is established first as an assumption, and the appropriate choice of a measuring process and device comes secondary. And the device that wins out in the end, that is, the human hand, isn't the one which is considered to be most accurate or reliable, at least in the traditional sense of those terms. Although this case could lead us to re-examine what we really mean when we say an instrument is accurate or reliable. If you find that these properties are not actually borne out within the physical circumstances you intend to use the instrument, is it really as accurate or reliable as you claim? And that, I think, is something worth emphasizing. These are not just practical constraints. They turn out to be truly epistemic issues. In the context of cervimetry, the issue of coherence and non-interference between the human body and the measuring instrument was an epistemic problem, and one that trumped the importance of traditional notions of validity and reliability. It's not hard to see why when we remember that cervimeter instruments were always being compared relative to the gold standard of by-hand assessment. which had fewer problems with interrupting the physiological process it was attempting to measure. Why settle for a substitute measure when the gold standard is already accessible, practical, and produces more interpretable data, and therefore was more epistemically valuable? I think there's a lot of maturation that our philosophical views on measurement can gain from the history of failed standard methods of measurement like the cervimeter, and non-standard success stories like digital cervimetry. The process of refining a measuring practice in the clinical context, as opposed to the research context, seems to have a lot more to do with positive patient outcomes than with precise coordination with empirical properties. And on a more cynical note, not just patient outcomes, but legal outcomes as well. The increased emphasis on patient rights and autonomy that took place in the 1950s and 70s laid the groundwork for greater legal liability for practitioners and hospitals in the US. Now, how do you avoid bad legal outcomes? That's accomplished by, 1, having positive patient outcomes, or at least 2, having a quantifiable defense of your patient care practices, no matter what the outcome. The by-hand method of cervimetry, which is both expedient and informative, while providing data reported in the formal unit of centimeters, has allowed for both satisfactorily for the liable parties involved. To summarize, I think what this history really brings out is how important the human decisions we need to make, the physical and temporal constraints of the situation at hand, and the communication of evidence that needs to take place during and after the measuring process are to what counts as good measurement, even for measuring something as basic, as fundamental, as physical as a distance.
Instead of a proper formal conclusion, let me offer you a concluding bouquet of thoughts and observations. So first, I think the examples show that some of the standard assumptions of the philosophy of measurement may not always be true. Measuring does not always mean progress. Quantitative knowledge is not always sound knowledge, and more precise is not always better. In fact, the cases show that the protagonists sometimes had very different ideas of what a good measurement was. A good measurement sometimes had to be convenient for the practitioner. It had to be communicable in its results. And very importantly, it had to be harmless for the persons involved. These are norms that are not usually covered in the philosophy of measurement, and the examples that we have may imply that there's something to be brought to this field. At the same time, we saw that philosophical tools, such as the framework of causal processes that we suggested, help to bring different cases in conversation with each other. Cases as different, in fact, as Lavoisier's calorimeter and Courtefeuille's phallometry. So our main conclusion, therefore, is probably that the analysis of measuring practices is very complicated, and it needs a combination of all the meta-scientific disciplines that we have. This is why we brought this panel to the ISH conference. This is what the ISH conference is about, and we are now looking forward to your questions and comments.
I'm out of here.